Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Teachers of Tomorrow podcast, your one-stop shop for all things education here at Alice Lloyd. I'm Garrett Reynolds.
I'm Jordan Horn.
And today we're going to be talking about vocabulary, specifically how to make the classroom into a safe, encouraging, and vocabulary-rich environment. So, Jordan, if you want to get started.
Vocabulary is a very important thing when it comes to the classroom setting, obviously. And one of the major issues that comes with teaching vocabulary is oftentimes teachers will find it too difficult to actively address the issue. So instead of teaching kids a more complicated word, they will choose an easier word when, in all actuality, that more complicated word will help them a lot more down the line.
Right now, we're in a teaching reading class, and our professor is bringing up some really good points. Pretty much, reading and vocabulary isn't just important in English, it's important in every subject, because in every subject, like in math, you're going to have to read word problems, you're going to have to read tables and science. Everything has reading and vocabulary. And also, something we're going to bring up, just so that way it's a little bit easier to talk about down the line, is something we've learned is that there are 3 different tiers of words. Tier 1 words, which are kind of like baby words, which are like words that students pick up before they even enter school. Tier 2 is words that can replace Tier 1 words, like instead of saying something's really wet or really damp, they'll say it's like really moist. And then Tier 3 is more so words specifically to a specific subject. Like you would say atmospheric for science, you would say like
a narrative for English,
perpendicular for math, like that kind of stuff. So if we say Tier 1, 2, or 3 word, just keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm. So one thing I found during researching this issue is it was on the Reading Rockets website, and it mentioned a study by Graves and Watts, and it said a student typically will learn 3,000 to 4,000 new words each year, and that's a good bit of words, and students can very much vary depending on their just home life, how they interact with their parents. There are many different things that go into where a student is in terms of their vocabulary and what they hear in the world around them.
Yeah. What was that one study we read called like the 3 million word gap?
Yeah, the 3 million word gap. I can't remember the exact statistics of it off the top of my head. Do you have
I remember that like they took 4 different classes of family, like 2 from lower class, 2 from middle class, and 2 from higher class, I think it was. Then they estimated about the amount of words that the students would hear in a day. Then used that to estimate how many more words rich kids would hear opposed to the lower economic kids. Mm-hmm. And they found that number was about 3 million words.
Yeah. And while that study does have many issues with it and a lot of things it kind of purposefully ignores or non-purposefully ignores, such as students who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, their parents might be more likely to have certain dialect that they may be embarrassed in, because the way a study was done was people would come in and observe this. So these people who kind of might not be sure of themselves or feel like insecure might be more likely to just kind of stay quiet when it came to being interviewed and stuff.
Yeah, and then we'll find the exact study we're thinking of, and we'll put a link to it in the description of the video, so that way you guys can go and read for it for yourselves. Yeah. So that way you can have the first-hand experience of reading the article. Yeah,
there will be a good bit of links below.
Yeah, but moving on to more about how this can be used in the classroom. So the first thing we're going to talk about is how to just make the classroom a safe and encouraging place for students. So first off, students shouldn't be afraid to ask questions. If they have a question about like what a word means or what the word's context is, as educators, we need to let them know it's okay to ask those kind of questions. Because I'm in a 3rd grade class, and if I give them an article about like atmospheric weather conditions, they might not know what atmospheric means. So I need to make sure they know it's okay to ask me questions about that.
Mm-hmm. And even if a word might appear simple, like there's times where, say, a word will show up and you might assume everyone in the class will know it. That's not always necessarily the case, because certain times certain students just don't have that specific background knowledge. And one thing that we've talked about a good bit in class that's very important when it comes to teaching this background knowledge is something called scaffolding, which is basically you have to build knowledge upon knowledge in order to further the kids' understanding.
Yeah. And a good way to kind of help kids scaffold is give them some kind of activity they can do to help remember the word. Like something I thought of that I used for one of our assignments is having the students draw a picture of what the word means, along with putting a short description of the word. So going back to the atmospheric article, if I told them the word atmospheric, they might draw a picture of a cloudy sky, and then write the words atmospheric means something in the sky, or something like that.
Another one you brought up that was a really good idea was having them use the certain vocabulary you picked out for, like, creating a creative story, like a creating writing assignment. And I feel like that one was a really unique one that I have thought about a good bit since.
Yeah. That was something I mentioned back during our class because it was something I remember doing a lot in school. Like whenever we got a new list of vocabulary words, something the teacher would do is if we got done with our work early, she would say, okay, try and write a story using all 10 of the vocabulary words. And if you do it, you'll get a piece of candy or something.
Mm-hmm. And there are many other ways you can try to get these ideas out there, and this vocabulary words out there to the students in fun ways. You could do a Kahoot, for example. You could do a crossword puzzle. You can do many things that kind of get these kids thinking about not only the word, but what the word means, how it can be used in a sentence. Just kind of not just knowing the word, but understanding the word, which I think is very important when it comes to vocabulary.
Yeah. Something about vocabulary is, again, in our reading class, we've learned that there are two main skills related to vocabulary. There's language comprehension, which is how a student actually approaches learning a language. And then there's decoding, which is actually breaking a word down into what it means. And students need to have a good mix of both language comprehension and decoding skills to actually fully grasp the English language. Mm-hmm. Even just younger kids, we need to make sure they get those skills early, so that way by the time they're in middle and high school, they're like, oh, I know how to read this, I know how to decode this.
Mm-hmm. And one specific strategy that really goes a long way, and it might seem kind of simple, but it really does help, is a lot of times teachers will often, when teaching a more complicated word, they'll be more likely to, instead of saying the word, they'll say a simpler word. Like, instead of, I think an example it used in one of the articles was, instead of saying something is alphabetical, they'll say that it's based on the ABCs. Whereas if you said the word alphabetical and then explained to the kids what it meant, they can be more likely to understand it, and it'll help them in the future.
Yeah, going back to the different tiers of words, they're pretty much taking tier 2 and 3 words and describing them using tier 1 words, which is okay in some contexts, but I feel like it's more important to teach kids tier 2 and 3 words than have to replace those words with tier 1 words.
And one strategy that we heard in the class from another student was basically use the tier 2 and tier 1 words interchangeably. That way the students can be like, hear it in one sentence and hear the exact same sentence, but with that word more a tier 2 word, and they'll be like, huh, okay, those mean the same thing. So it can kind of just help connect that for them.
Yeah. Moving more so into different activities you can do to help kids with their vocabulary, one thing that I was looking into was a sort of vocabulary bingo. Pretty much you give the kids like a bingo sheet, with different vocabulary words on it. Then you stand in front of the class and be like, okay everyone, what does it mean when something is relating to the sky? And if one of the kids has the word atmospheric, they circle it. Then we move all the way down the list, and whoever gets a bingo first gets a prize.
I think that's a really good way to kind of keep the kids entertained, but also make sure that they're following along and on track, understanding the vocabulary being used.
Yeah.
So I really like that idea. Another issue that kind of comes up in certain classrooms is if you have a student who is an English learner, like they are learning English as a second language rather than being their native language. A lot of times, an article we went over, and we'll have linked in the description, it mentions that a lot of times the teachers will be less likely to try to connect with that student's culture, as they're worried about being culturally insensitive, so instead they just ignore it altogether. When, as the article by Jacqueline Mesra mentioned, that sometimes that student will just be more accepting of the effort and attempt. Like the specific one it used, it mentioned was a teacher used words like mijo and just Spanish dialect occasionally to kind of connect with that student, just to kind of further their understanding of it.
Yeah. Also, something we're also learning about in one of our teaching classes is the different teaching standards. And I'm pretty sure that using different languages in your instruction is either part of standard 2 or 3. There's 10 of them. I can't remember them all off the top of my head. I know one is about the content of the class. I can't remember the rest of them, though.
Mm-hmm. And one important thing that comes with talking about, like, the different cultures, and especially something in this area of Appalachia, is the idea of a lot of times students and even teachers to a certain extent might feel like their vocabulary or their dialect or accent makes them feel like less than what they are, because it's oftentimes, like, for example, we live in Kentucky, we're born and raised, and sometimes our accent can come out more than we intend it to, and sometimes that can be embarrassing, but it shouldn't be. And that's the important thing to teach the students, is that you shouldn't be embarrassed of that. And there are certain situations where it can be better to kind of attempt to speak more proper, or speak with less specific emphasis on certain things, whereas due to it's called code switching, so that can kind of be a useful tip to kind of teach students, because there are things in their, like, after school that can help with, such as job interviews or college applications or just things like that, things where sounding more professional is very helpful.
Yeah. I've seen kind of a 50-50 split on people agreeing or disagreeing on about whether code switching should be implemented. I personally don't see a problem with it, because, like, if we were just sitting here, I'd be like, "Hey, Jordan, what's up? How you doing?" But
yeah.
if I wouldn't talk with the professor. I'd be like, "Hi, Dr. Horn, how are you doing today?" Like, I'd be like that. I feel like code switching is definitely a thing that should be taught. Maybe not, like, super specific or anything. Don't quote me on that, but just, like, let them know that there are certain situations where you need to act more professional and you need to carry yourself more like that.
Yeah, the thing about code switching is we all do it on the day-to-day. It's just most of the time we don't realize it. The thing is, you kind of want to teach to your students that they are doing this and that there's certain times where it's more applicable. Like, for me, for example, if the students are writing a narrative, I would probably want them to not use specific Appalachian dialogue like y'all. But if we're just having a class discussion about a topic, I would love if they included their Appalachian dialogue, because I don't want them to feel embarrassed of it or ashamed, because where you're from isn't something to be ashamed of.
Yeah. An accent isn't really shouldn't be an indicator about how intelligent you are, because no matter what, there are people all across the world who speak in different dialects and different accents, and that shouldn't be the first thing you think of. I shouldn't think like, oh, he's from Appalachia, he must not be that smart. I shouldn't be thinking that.
Yeah, and that's sadly a lot of times what people do, and that's just kind of a sad fact of the world. Another thing that I mentioned earlier about English learners, there are certain ways beyond that you can probably implement it. Like me personally, if I had a student whose native language is Spanish and they were here to learn English, I would more than likely implement, say, a Spanish short story or a novel or something to keep them more engaged with the subject. That way they don't feel completely isolated and left behind with the topic.
Like I said, there is an entire learning standard about using different dialects and different languages in your studies.
Mm-hmm. But I think that does it for my points. Do you have anything you want to add, Garrett?
I've talked about everything I want to talk about.
Okay, well, this has been the Teachers of Tomorrow podcast. Thank you all. We'll see you next time.
See ya.